I'm Frances Kamm, and I'm honored to have been asked to chair this section of the conference, this session of the conference. The speaker is Ruth Tallman, who is a professor at Barry University in the philosophy department, and it's in Miami, where many of us wish we could be. And the topic of her, the title of her talk is Valuing Lives and Allocating Resources, a defense of the modified youngest first principle of scarce resource distribution. These are topics that are of great interest to me, so I know we all look forward to the talk.
Okay, so first of all, can you hear me? Is this good? Okay, good. So I don't have a PowerPoint, so you should all have a handout. If you don't have a handout, we have some extras up here. So I'll just be sort of talking through the handout roughly. What I've given you there are definitions, things like that. So my paper is responding to the proposal of scarce medical resource allocation by Govind Prasad, Alan Wertheimer, and Ezekiel Emanuel, and they call it the Complete Lives System. And a particular part of that system is this modified youngest first principle. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background from their paper and then go on to my defense. Just sort of, I'm taking as basic that we can make judgments, make reasonable judgments about some lives being more worth saving. And if we can't do that, then I would just say it's going to have to be a lottery, and none of what I'm saying goes through. So I'm just taking as an assumption that we can make some judgments about this. So the Complete Lives System argues that complete lives are to be valued over individual life episodes. And so resources should be allocated in such a way that complete lives can be maximized rather than just getting individuals through a particular current medical crisis without sort of looking to the way their lives might go in the future. So their definition that I accept also is that a complete life is one that lasts long enough for its owner to have the opportunity for the range of experiences normal for a human being. And the argument here is that we value life because it affords us the opportunity to develop and carry out a life plan in which we set goals and projects for ourselves, and then we see them through, or we're able to attempt to see them through to fruition. The idea is that the death of a young person is particularly sad because that person is unable to accomplish the particular vision that he had for himself. So just real briefly, the 5 principles of the Complete Lives System. The first one is the modified youngest first principle, which says that priority should be given to adolescents and young adults over infants and over the elderly, and the age range is 15 to 40 is the sweet spot. And this is coming from the original article, and I'm not challenging that, although I would certainly recognize that the 15 to 40 is, I mean, those numbers are arbitrary, but if you're making a policy, you have to set the numbers somewhere. So why 15 instead of 14? I mean, just because you have to pick a spot. Number 2, prognosis. So preference is going to be given to the individuals that are most likely to experience a long-term benefit from the resource. Save the most lives. More complete lives are better than fewer, so if you can allocate so that you can save more human beings, that would be a good thing. Instrumental value is only implemented in emergencies. In this case, it's going to be justified to first save those who will then be able to save others. So we're talking about in crisis situations where you need to have the healthcare professionals on hand to then help others. And then with these 5 principles, they're supposed to all be considered as appropriate. If 1 through 4 you end up with a tie or something similar to a tie, then you go to a lottery. And so what I'm doing is focusing only on the modified youngest first principle for the rest of my talk, and I'm defending it against what I'm calling the simple youngest first principle, which would be just we allocate resources are allocated from youngest to oldest starting at birth. And so to remind you, the modified says we start around age 15 instead. So Sam and Greg have responded to this and argue that this is discriminating against the young in a way that it doesn't discriminate against the old, right? So you might just object to allocating resources based on age at all, because this is unfair. Life is valuable regardless of whether you're 60 or whether you're 20. But it's maybe a particular problem with the young. So regarding the elderly, they already had their chance. They already were young, and so there was a point in their lives at which they were first, or were ranked first. But if we skip over the very young, they never get that opportunity, and so this seems unjust. So there are a couple of arguments, a couple of ways we can go to defend this position. The first one, and this is coming from the original article, Prasad et al., based on social good. And so the argument there is that through the beginning of your life, until you reach adulthood, you're just sucking up resources, right? Children are expensive, they're just taking in. But then they pay that back after they grow up and they give in to society. And so adolescence is the point where any individual has taken in the most and given the least back. And so it makes more sense to sort of save this investment so that you then have time, they have time in the future to give back. Whereas with an infant, society has given in to that, contributed to that individual less in terms of education and money and things like that. So that's one way to go. And I don't think that's a bad way to go. I think it does make sense to consider the social good because these resources are sort of shared in common by society, and it makes sense we decide how to distribute them. But that's not what I'm doing. So what I'm doing is giving an argument based on the individual good to the recipient of the resources, or the potential recipient of the resources. And so the way this is explained in the Complete Lives article, this is a quote, adolescence brings with it a developed personality capable of forming and valuing long-term plans whose fulfillment requires a complete life. And so the idea here is, if we're talking about complete lives, why are they valuable? They're valuable because they're valuable to the individual who's experiencing it. The value comes in that individual setting goals and then seeing them through. Coming at it from that point, I think it's is beneficial because we avoid some of these problems of that were actually raised earlier today. A person, an external evaluator, is likely to say a life with some sort of disability has a much diminished quality of life, but a person with a disability is likely to say, man, it's not so bad, right? I mean, I think my life has plenty of value. And so arguing from the subjective point of view avoids those sort of problems because it's, we're looking at how much value does this life have to me. So two arguments. First of all, in favor of the modified youngs. First, slightly older individuals already in the midst of their complete lives, and so they ought to be preferenced for that reason. And secondly, slightly older individuals are capable of assigning first-person value to their lives. So a complete life is one in which, so I just want to talk a little bit about what this idea of a complete life means. A complete life is one in which the individual is able to see his projects through, whatever those projects happen to be. Now, this is important because we want to avoid the system isn't supposed to be a social worth system. It's not supposed to be because we should save this life because these individuals need to repay some sort of debt to society, right? So the idea would be if your projects and goals were going to contribute to the social good, then you should be preferenced over someone who has more individualistic projects and goals. And so on my argument is the individual themselves gets to set their projects, and what's important is not how other people evaluate what those goals and projects are, but how the individual assigns value to them. So the idea of a complete life is admittedly kind of fuzzy, but I think we know it when we see it. So a 20-year-old hasn't had a complete life. 90-year-old has had a complete life. Some characteristics. Your career has ended, your kids are raised, you're probably no longer in caregiving roles, you might be moving into care receiving roles, these types of things. You're not necessarily going to have been successful in your life, you aren't necessarily going to be happy in order to have had a complete life. There's no minimum number of accomplishments that have to have been met. The lives are not all going to be completed within the same number of years, but the concept aims to capture the time frame that's normal for a human being. Not all your goals must be finished, but what I'm talking about here is the idea of major long-term life goals. So To sort of sum up that idea, the complete life system aims to give those who are on this typical time frame the extra life needed to complete projects that they would have been able to finish were it not for their medical crisis. It seeks to give those who are midlife a chance to finish what they've started. And because of the first-person approach that I'm taking, the experiencer of the life must have sufficient cognizance and self-awareness to be able to appreciate the complete life. And I argue that this requires that three conditions be met. They must be able to understand the concept of a complete life. They must have goals and projects that they want to see through to completion. And their goals or projects must be of the type that, given a reasonable amount of time, they could be seen to completion, such that the individual could imagine what it would be for those goals to be met and thus to have achieved a complete life. Okay, so why is it important for the experiencer to be able to understand the concept? So one thing that's important noting here, the experiencer doesn't have to actually have thought about the concept, but the experiencer is going to need to be someone that if you explain it to them, they can understand what you're talking about. And I think this is important because if you can't understand the concept, then you're not going to be able to live it out. Because contained in the concept is the idea that you're able to set these goals for yourself and then see them through, and without having this kind of long-term awareness of how you want your life to go, that wouldn't be possible. And additionally, you wouldn't feel the same sense of loss at your life being cut short. Why must you have goals and projects in place? I think this is important because I'm taking it as basic that it's worse for life to be cut short rather than for life to fail to begin. And I realize that can be argued, but it seems clear to me that the particular loss is and that the complete life system is trying to capture is that there's this suffering that comes from being in the middle of projects that you're not able to see through. And if you're not, and so if you don't yet have these goals and projects in place, arguably, even though you're biologically alive, you're not yet in the midst of this thing that we would call a potentially complete life. You're sort of getting ready to have that life, but it hasn't yet started. Okay, and then finally, why must you be able to recognize what your complete life would look like? You have to know what the completed life would look like in order to kind of know how to get there. So I think these factors justify the modified youngest first principle. The very young don't understand the concept of complete life. They don't have goals and plans in motion, and they don't know what it would be like for their lives to be complete. Now, an objection is that in order for this argument to go through, we have to accept that setting life goals is valuable. Otherwise, none of this makes any sense. So shouldn't we give those who have not yet had a chance to set those goals a chance to do so? And my response is that because I'm basing this on the subjective value that comes from the owner of the life, because of that, we're also committed to recognizing that the very young aren't going to be capable of assigning that value yet. So they're not yet able to set the goals. They're also not yet able to recognize the value in their lives or the value in setting those goals. So the very young can experience, but they can't yet reflect on their experiences. They can't consider how their lives might go better or worse, and they can't consider whether they want their lives to continue. Now, we can argue that it's a baseline assumption for people to have a preference for life over death, and so we could say, well, probably the very young would prefer that also, and that probably is the case. But we also know that in some cases, people who are able to make that judgment don't prefer life over death in some cases, and so we could assume that there would be some infants that would be, or very young, that would also not prefer life over death. I just want to note also that first-person value isn't going to be the only kind that I think should be counted. The very young often have many third parties that are valuing them as well, but there are going to be situations, if there are situations, where the sum total of values under consideration between two individuals for resources is nearly equal. An individual who also gives his own life, or first-person value, the scales will be tipped in his favor. Just to conclude, for a biological life to be one in which we could attribute the descriptors complete or incomplete, the subject of that life must be able to understand the concept of a complete life, to have started goals and projects, and to know what it would be like for that life to be complete. Additionally, first-person value is a very important value, and it's one that the very young are not yet able to attribute to their lives. And so for these reasons, I argued that the modified youngest first principle is to be preferred over the simple youngest first principle.
That was a little bit shorter time-wise, so we may have a few extra minutes. Not necessarily for you, but for questions. Our commentator is, a responder, is Professor Samuel Kerstein of the University of Maryland Philosophy Department.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for allowing me to reply to this interesting paper. I've enjoyed thinking about it. Let me just say something very quickly about the complete life system. Professor Tallman, Ruth, talked about it a little bit, but it's a set of principles that Prasad, Wertheimer, and Emanuel developed to, they say, justly allocate persistently scarce life-saving interventions. And it includes 5 principles: save the most lives; Prognosis, save the most life years; modified youngest first, which prioritizes the saving of adolescents and young adults, those between 15 and 40, over the saving of young children and older adults, as well as a principle of lottery to be used in certain limited contexts, and also a principle of instrumental value that's applicable only in public health emergencies. What I want to emphasize is that through advocating the modified youngest first principle, Prasad, Wertheimer, and Emanuel aren't committed to the view that we should save a 20-year-old who would live for just 1 year over a 55-year-old who would live for 40 years. Okay, these principles have to be balanced against one another, and in the examples that I use, I'm going to assume that other things are equal. Okay, so prognosis is the same, is the key assumption. Here is Prasad, Wertheimer, and Emanuel's illustration of the modified youngest first principle. You can see that it gives significantly greater probability of receiving a life-saving intervention to someone who's 25 than to someone who's 7. It gives greater probability to someone who's 7 than to someone who's 4. Of course, a youngest first principle, in contrast to modified youngest first principle, would move from the northwest to the southeast towards Miami. Just go straight to Miami. And that's the contrast that we're thinking about. Here's what I take Ruth to be claiming. She's got a weaker claim, I think, and that is that we have sufficient reason to prefer the modified youngest first principle over the youngest first principle in an allocation system. And then a stronger claim is that the modified youngest first principle is morally justified. That claim is stronger because one might embrace the weaker claim and reject the stronger one. One might say, well, actually, modified youngest first is better than youngest first, but neither of them are any good. Okay? I'm going to spend most of the time on the weaker claim, but I will have something to say about the stronger claim near the end. Here's what I take Ruth's argument for the weaker claim to be. Lives that are in the midst of being complete are more valuable than lives that are not. Modified youngest first takes better account of this than youngest first. Therefore, we have sufficient reason to prefer modified youngest first to youngest first in an allocation system. I'm just going to focus on the first premise, although I think that there's room for argument in the transition between 2 and 3. So the question is, are lives that are in the midst of being complete more valuable, as Ruth says, than lives that are not? An initial question to pose is, what does it mean for a life to be in the midst of being complete? She gives a set of necessary conditions for this. In order for a person's life to be in the midst of being complete, he must first be able to understand the concept of a complete life. Second, have life goals and projects that he wants to see to completion. And third, be able to recognize what his complete life would look like. Now, regarding the first condition about being able to understand the concept of a complete life in order to be in the midst of a complete life and thus have supposedly greater value, I don't know whether I understand that concept. And I'm going to try to, I think this can be fixed, but at the point in which I read the paper, I'm not sure I understand the concept. And I'm not sure I'm able to understand the concept because I'm not sure it's coherent. And I don't think, this is an aside, I don't think that I have lower value because of that. So first, Ruth says that a complete life is one in which life goals and projects are set for oneself, and then an attempt is made to carry those goals through to fruition. Okay, so imagine a young gymnast. Her goals are to get to the Olympics and win a medal. She devotes all of her energies to that. That's her main set of projects. She strives and strives. She fails. She doesn't make the Olympic team, let alone win a medal. One might think that Ruth would, given just that citation, conclude that she'd had a complete life. I don't think that she really wants to say that, and I also don't think that it's plausible to think that she has had a complete life, even though she has set a project, a life goal, and tried to realize it. She later, in a different passage, she says, a complete life is one that lasts long enough for its owner to have the opportunity for the range of experiences normal for a human being. Okay, out with the gymnast example, right? She failed, she set those projects, but she hasn't had the set of experiences normal for a human being. So Ruth isn't committed to saying that she's had a complete life. But then I get confused because later in her paper, Ruth says, in light of the increasing human lifespan, people will live decades after their lives are complete. A 70-year-old, while in the midst of many projects, would still be said to have had a complete life. Now, in the paper, I get the impression that Ruth holds the following. Suppose that the average lifespan went way, way up to, say, 100 years. Nevertheless, we would say that a typical 70-year-old had had a complete life. Maybe we would use the marker she appealed to. She has grandchildren and so forth. But the problem arises because that person, given the supposition that the lifespan has increased on average so much, would not have had an opportunity for the range of experiences normal for a human being, because that person would not have lived through extreme old age. So I'm confused about what the concept of a complete life that we're supposed to be able to understand to have higher value amounts to. Now, regarding the second condition, remember the second condition has to do with one's forming life projects. Suppose that a 4-year-old wants to have his own landscaping company. He can detail the blowers, trimmers, mowers, and trucks he would someday like to buy, as well as the sorts of jobs he would like to join his employees in taking on. Does he have a life goal? If not, why not? I think that he does have a life goal. That's my own view. In any case, I'm not sure whether Ruth would want to say that he does, and I'd be interested to see why he doesn't, if he doesn't. Suppose he does have a life goal, but is nevertheless unable to understand the concept of a complete life. Here's the question. Why would that make his life less valuable than that of someone who has life goals and is able both to understand the concept of a complete life and recognize what his complete life would look like? That claim is asserted, but I'm not feeling the intuitive pull of it. Now, in the paper, Ruth suggests that it's supposed to be because the boy would suffer less at the prospect of his life's being lost. But in general, I don't think we think that someone's suffering less at the prospect of his life's being lost entails that his life has lower value than it would otherwise have. Imagine two development workers, or people striving to improve the quality of life of people in the developing world. One has a nice system of proteges, really competent, trained people that are going to carry through with the project. The other hasn't developed that sort of group of people. Now, it might be that the one who has the good proteges is going to be less sad about the prospect of his life's ending than the other. But we wouldn't say, I don't think, that his life is thereby less valuable. Okay, let me just say something really briefly about Ruth's stronger claim that the modified youngest first principle is morally justified. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that she has established that lives that are in the midst of being complete are more valuable than lives that are not. I'm not sure at what age people start to lead a life that is in the midst of being complete, but let's assume that it's after 10. According to the modified youngest first principle, an illustration of which I had on the board earlier, 7-year-olds get significantly higher priority for life-saving interventions than do 4-year-olds, even though members of neither age group are presumably in the midst of leading a complete life. What's the justification for this priority? If the principle as a whole is going to be justified, then that part of the principle has to be justified. That priority needs to be justified. I don't think Ruth has shown that older children who fall below the threshold of being in the midst of a complete life have greater value than younger children who fall below the threshold of being in the midst of having a complete life. Now, maybe at this point, Ruth would appeal to an investment argument or an appeal to social good, the idea being that, well, more was invested in the 7-year-old, so we would lose more if the 7-year-old died than the 4-year-old. But although I don't want to get into that here, I don't have time for it, I don't find that argument convincing. I think it shows a lack of respect for the worth of the life of the 4-year-old. Moreover, the priority given to the 7-year-old over the 4-year-old is problematic in the context of the complete life system. Why? Well, if you look at Prasad, Wertheimer, and Emanuel's paper, their system supposedly justifies preference to younger people because of priority to the worst off. That's the justification they give. And the question arises, why wouldn't this justification favor, and plausibly favor, the 4-year-old over the 7-year-old, especially if we assume, as Prasad and colleagues seem to, that life years are supremely valuable. In fact, they just say that they're supremely valuable. So, in effect, I think that since Ruth hasn't justified a significant part of the principle of modified youngest first, even if we grant her value assumptions earlier on, she doesn't succeed in justifying the principle as a whole. Thanks.
You ask if the lives in the midst of being complete are supposed to be more valuable on my account because the subject's going to suffer more at its being cut off in the middle, talking about the boy. So my response is that there's really two different points there. So first, it's worse to start and not finish something than it is to not even start. But then there's also the separate point that that more is lost with lives when the subject himself is valuing his life. And then secondly, with the 7-year-old, 4-year-old question, I think there would be, it might be that in this case we should just resort to a lottery if there's no difference in terms of whether a complete life has begun to start, whether maybe I don't know much about 7-year-olds, but if the 7-year-old would be feeling a loss that the 4-year-old wouldn't be feeling, then that would give us reason to preference. And if not, if they're both equally equal on these points, then we would just go to the lottery portion of the system. And those were the two main things I wanted to respond to. I guess I would say, yeah, I mean, you're doing the math right. But that's, so I guess I'm approaching it from a different place, and I'm going to say, even though overall the 8 to 80 would give us more years, what I'm looking at is at the point at which the person is either 8 or 18, and we have to make a decision. And so if the person's 8 right now, and they don't get the life-saving treatment, they're never going to be 18, right? And they're never going to be in the middle of that life. They're never going to have the level of awareness. So I'm looking at the point of loss, the feeling of loss, that the subject is experiencing when they get or when they don't get the treatment. I think we're kind of just doing different things. Right? Okay. I mean, I totally see what you mean. You're getting more years. I want to say, yes, I mean, we would prefer them to be able to complete their goals. But I'm also committed to the idea that the value of the goals is set by the individual, not by us. But it's also, it's important, and it's in the paper explicitly, that this has to be the type of thing that can happen, right? So if my goal is to, I don't know, go to Mars, then that's it. That one's not happening, and that's, I mean, that if it's not clear to me, it's a problem with me. But what I don't want to discount is that someone who sets higher goals for themselves is less likely to achieve them, but that shouldn't count against them. I mean, you know, if my only goal is to work at McDonald's, I can probably manage it. But if instead my goal is to work at Harvard, that's going to be a lot harder. And so, I don't know, maybe I lost the question. I mean, I want to say, as long as it is achievable, whether or not the person succeeds shouldn't factor in. They get the amount of time that they could complete it, and if they fail, okay, by that time they're 40 and they're off the list anyway. Outside of deciding whether or not they're going to get our resource, there may be other things that we ought to do, like try to prevent them from succeeding in their deplorable goals. So, I mean, maybe the question you're asking, or at least an implication, is should criminals get the same consideration as everyone else? And I guess on the complete lives system, they would have to. Because we're not making judgments about social value, anything like that. I mean, that is something I'll need to think about, because that's yeah. And this is maybe similar to sort of the objection that you raised about as lifespans increase. So maybe a way I can respond to this is to say, even though we may have a series of goals over the course of our lives, that it makes sense to preference those who haven't even completed their first set, or something like that. So if, you know, say you have a goal that you finish by the time you're 35. But then you've still got plenty of life, and so you set these new goals and you work toward those. I think it would still be reasonable to say someone who hasn't even sort of had a fair shot to work through one plan would be preferenced when preferences have to be made over someone who's, you know, onto their third career or something like that. I mean, this is policy. This isn't like when we're considering you for a resource, we're going to look at your resume, right? So, I mean, I think what I would say to that is we're setting these age ranges, and I don't think the important thing isn't to scrutinize, do you have goals, are your goals appropriate, how far along are you, but that there are, in general, for human beings, that there's this period of our lives where we're active, we're in the midst of doing things, and then we recognize that eventually we kind of age out of that. And some people age out sooner and some later, but eventually we reach this, like my father spends most of his time watching the Weather Channel, and he's past the productive period of his life. So it's, I certainly don't want to make it about if you're just sort of going along having a good time and not setting big plans, that you go to the back of the line. So yeah. Yes, I want to accept that and say I love cat examples. And thank you.
I'd like to say that Near doesn't appreciate the intrinsic value of cats, and that's a bad thing. And secondly, that I just think that in these debates, there's another point of view, which is that the 18-year-old had a chance to live, had a chance to fall in love, had a chance to develop projects, and the much younger person hasn't had that chance. I personally find that pull stronger. My response would be because I think some lives really are worth saving, more worth saving than others. I know this is a place where we just completely disagree, but I mean, I would say that, for instance, because some of us can assign first-person value to our lives and some of us can't, that means we should give preference to those of us who can. And so the lottery would not take things like that into consideration. My response before you kept talking was going to be that, right, my nephew wanted to be a clown, and he doesn't anymore, right? So usually we say children, even though they have these lofty goals, we want to be ballerinas and astronauts and stuff, that we drop those goals pretty quickly, and that we aren't, a good point, even if it's a realistic goal, when you're 4, you're not really going to be able to do much to start making that happen until you're older, whereas with adults we can. But then, I mean, I think you raise a really good problem that many adults can't actually do what they need to do to get those goals realized. So what do we do about that? So, I mean, one thing, again, so this needs to be a goal that the individual himself has to understand what it would be for that to happen, right? So if an adult has this goal that they also have no idea how to carry that out, then I would think that would also be a problem. Again, I sort of want to fall back on this. This is a policy thing rather than a scrutinizing individuals. And are you sure you understand what it means to be a hairdresser or whatever, and that you have to go to school for that and all of this. So in general, human beings take we need a good chunk of years to make these things happen. By the time we've reached a certain age, we've had the chance to make them happen. If we fail to do so, then we've had the opportunity, at least. Success or failure is less important than having had the opportunity. Yeah, I think you raise really good points. I mean, it's my understanding that the Complete Lives model was set up, mainly thinking of the U.S., but that doesn't mean that it should be in that way, right? So, I mean, the 14 to 40, I just took straight from the original article, and I didn't challenge that. But if you're living in a society where adulthood starts much younger, then yeah, I would think we would need to take that into consideration. If you raise an interesting point with grandparents having a hand in raising their children. So I mean, I just have to admit that I was really looking at our culture when I wrote this, so I'll have to give that some more thought because that's a really good point. So the original Complete Lives article talked both about social good and individual good. And I really think that the way to go is to focus on the individual good, the good for the person. So I wouldn't want to deny that the elderly can be useful in many ways. But I would just say, in terms of looking at it, and again, this is, I mean, the big point of the paper was to argue
against starting the allocations, the preference at birth, right, and starting it a bit later. So I really wasn't looking at the elderly too much, but I guess I would say there that the more important value would still be the value of the life to the person experiencing it rather than to others.
I believe that our time is up. If so, I'm very sorry to those who didn't get to ask questions.